When John Denver's plane went down on that clear October afternoon in 1997, the shockwaves hit far beyond the world of music. The voice that gave us Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Annie's Song was silenced in an instant. News outlets around the globe replayed his greatest hits. Tributes poured in from fans and fellow artists, and vigils sprang up in places he loved. But while the public grieved, another story, far less poetic, was quietly beginning. Despite decades of record sales, countless sold-out concerts, and a portfolio of valuable real estate, Denver had died without a valid will. That single missing piece of paper flipped control of his estate into the hands of the state of California. Suddenly, the distribution of his assets wasn't up to his family. It was dictated by California's strict intestacy laws. The process was brutal. Everything Denver had built, his Aspen home, royalties from decades of music, even personal memorabilia, had to go through probate, a legal system that moves at a crawl. Over the next 6 years, lawyers, accountants, and court-appointed administrators dissected every piece of his financial life. For the family, it was more than bureaucracy. It was watching John's legacy reduced to spreadsheets and signatures. And then came the first whispers that not all of his fortune could be accounted for. Bank accounts didn't seem to match expectations. Valuations on certain properties looked surprisingly low. Royalties, which should have been a steady flow of income, appeared inconsistent. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was suspicion. And as it turned out, this was only the beginning, because what came next would turn a slow-moving legal nightmare into a full-blown financial showdown. As the probate slogged forward, another far more dangerous problem landed on the doorstep. The kind of problem you can't ignore: the Internal Revenue Service. And the IRS wasn't knocking politely. According to government auditors, John Denver's estate had been undervalued by roughly $2.5 million. That figure wasn't just an accounting disagreement, it was a challenge to the very foundation of the estate's filings. If the IRS was correct, the estate had shortchanged the government, meaning an extra $1.5 million in taxes would need to be paid on top of what was already owed. The claim was a gut punch to the family. They were still dealing with the public glare, still in the thick of probate delays, and now they were facing the full weight of a federal investigation. The IRS began combing through every corner of Denver's finances: real estate holdings in Colorado and California, publishing rights, concert earnings, and even the market value of his personal instruments and memorabilia. The accusations carried an unspoken sting. If the estate was truly undervalued, was it because of sloppy accounting or something more deliberate? Denver's heirs didn't back down. They pushed back with their own appraisers, their own legal experts, and a firm stance that the government's numbers were wrong. The dispute dragged on for months, each side presenting spreadsheets, witness statements, and market analysis. Millions of dollars and the family's credibility hung in the balance. And then came the twist no one had predicted: the IRS lost. Instead of writing a massive check to the government, the estate would soon be receiving a refund of nearly $600,000. It should have been a moment of relief. But as the family soon learned, a win on paper didn't mean the missing millions mystery was over. When the IRS dispute finally reached its conclusion, the outcome was nothing short of a plot twist. After months of tense back and forth, government lawyers conceded they hadn't proven their case. Instead of handing over $1.5 million, the Denver estate was issued a refund of nearly $600,000. For the family, it was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, they'd avoided a crushing tax bill. On the other, the fact that the IRS could have been so wrong made them wonder what else about John's financial picture was misunderstood or hidden. The refund didn't answer the biggest questions still looming over the probate process. Where was the rest of the money? An estate valued at nearly $19 million before taxes, with a career's worth of royalties and valuable property, should have left behind a much larger pool for heirs to divide. Yet, when the dust from the IRS battle settled, the numbers still didn't quite add up. Some of the missing value could be explained: legal fees, administrative costs, taxes. But there were still gaps that no one could easily account for. Certain assets had been liquidated quietly. Some sales seemed to fetch less than market value. And then there was a curious detail: several large trusts worth millions that had been created while John was still alive. Those trusts would lead investigators and curious fans down another path entirely. Because if John Denver had no will, why had he taken the time to set up secretive multi-million-dollar trusts? For a man who left no will, John Denver had been surprisingly deliberate in other parts of his estate planning. Long before his death, he had established a series of multi-million-dollar trusts, each reportedly worth around $7 million for the most important people in his life: his mother, his father, his ex-wife, and each of his 3 children. At first glance, it looked generous, proof that Denver wanted to provide for his loved ones. But the existence of these trusts also raised a few eyebrows. If he had the foresight to set up such significant financial protections, why didn't he also prepare a will to direct the rest of his fortune? Some speculated that Denver may have been wary of putting everything in writing because of the complicated dynamics in his personal life. His divorce had been messy. His career had gone through highs and lows. There were business partners, music rights contracts, and ongoing royalty arrangements that might have been easier to manage outside the public eye. Unlike a will, trusts aren't subject to the same level of public scrutiny in probate court. That means the details, what went in, who got what, and when, could remain private. But that privacy also created mystery. How much money passed through these trusts? Were they the reason so much of his fortune seemed missing from the official estate filings? And perhaps most puzzling of all, were these trusts the safety net Denver intended, or part of the reason his estate became so complicated after he was gone? These questions became even sharper when some of John's biggest dreams, projects he spoke about passionately while alive, suddenly vanished after his death. Because the next chapter in this story is about how pieces of his legacy were sold off despite everything he said he wanted to protect. John Denver wasn't just a chart-topping artist. He was a committed environmentalist who poured time, money, and heart into protecting nature. He often spoke about preserving open spaces, safeguarding wildlife, and ensuring future generations could enjoy the same beauty that inspired his music. One of his most ambitious dreams was turning portions of his Colorado property into a permanent wildlife sanctuary. But without a will to protect those wishes, the courts saw his land as just another asset, a piece of property to be appraised, sold, and divided. Slowly, pieces of that dream began to disappear. Parcels were sold to private buyers. Some were developed. What could have been a living monument to his environmental passion became just another line item in an estate inventory. For fans who knew Denver's values, it felt like a betrayal, not necessarily by the family, but by a system that treated his vision as less important than market value. Those acres weren't just dirt and trees. They were part of the man's identity. The irony stung. Here was someone who'd earned millions singing about the beauty of nature, yet the very land he loved couldn't be saved after his death. And with each sale, the mystery deepened. How much of that lost land factored into the fortune that seemed to vanish? If that wasn't enough to stir questions, what happened next would add another strange twist. Because long after his passing, properties tied to John Denver, some with deep personal history, would change hands for staggering sums. Years after John Denver's death, some of his most personal spaces, the places where he lived, worked, and created, began appearing on the real estate market. Each sale brought new headlines, not just because of the eye-watering prices, but because these properties held pieces of his story. His Carmel, California retreat, a peaceful coastal escape where he often wrote music, eventually sold for millions. In Aspen, his legendary recording studio, where timeless tracks were born, was converted into a luxury home and listed at prices that would have stunned even the most successful artists. These were not small transactions. Each one involved serious money that, depending on how they were structured, might have been part of the estate or might have been handled privately. That's where the questions returned. If these properties fetched such high sums, did those proceeds ever reach the heirs? Or were they tied up in trusts, private sales, or debts that swallowed the profits? Without a will spelling things out, tracing that money is nearly impossible for anyone outside the inner circle. To fans, these sales were bittersweet, seeing pieces of Denver's life traded like collectibles. To estate watchers, they were another piece of the puzzle, suggesting that the missing millions might not have disappeared at all, but instead quietly shifted into places few could follow. And that leads to one final question, one that still lingers decades later. When all was said and done, what truly happened to John Denver's fortune, and how much of it remains hidden to this day? When the probate papers were finally closed, when the IRS had walked away, and when the last disputed asset had been accounted for, at least on paper, you might expect the mystery to be over. But for many, it never really ended. Officially, the story is that John Denver's estate went through the normal, if painfully slow, legal process. Assets were valued, taxes were paid, properties were sold, and loved ones were provided for. The trust he had established before his death ensured that key family members received substantial benefits, even if the rest of his fortune was filtered through the courts. From that perspective, nothing was missing. And yet, to this day, questions remain. The original $19 million valuation of his estate, the millions tied up in trusts, the high-value properties sold long after his death, all of it leaves gaps big enough for rumors and speculation to thrive. Did some of his wealth disappear through quiet sales and private settlements? Were there assets intentionally kept out of public records? Or is it simply that the romantic idea of missing millions is more compelling than the reality of taxes, legal fees, and time? For fans, the debate isn't just about numbers, it's about legacy. John Denver's music captured the beauty of open skies, mountains, and human connection. His dream was to give back, to protect the world he loved. Whether his fortune was lost, hidden, or simply transformed, the real loss may be that some of those dreams never got the chance to take root. And maybe that's the lasting mystery, not just where the money went, but what could have been if every dollar had been used exactly as he intended.